All right, the rest of tonight is going to be based much more in U.S. history in the 1920s, specifically economic policy in the U.S. in the 20s. It's necessary to first go through the Russian Revolution to set a kind of political context, an international context that will largely dominate Europe and the United States foreign policy-wise in the 20s and 30s and even going into parts of the 40s. So it's important to set that up for the long term. But as we move into the 20s, we're going to focus much more on internal U.S. developments, especially economic, as most Americans thought was appropriate after the end of the Great War in 1919. Most Americans believed that the U.S. role in Europe had ended. They had signed the treaties that created all these kind of different democracies we're going to talk about later on. And the overwhelming sentiment in the United States was to bring the troops home and to bring the American focus back into the internal United States itself. The major economic change that hits the United States and starts spreading very quickly to the rest of the industrialized nations is called the assembly line. And this is innovated by American businessmen. Most notably and most famously put into effect by Henry Ford, the maker of Ford automobiles. The assembly line style is the logical end of Adam Smith's description of what he called in the 1700s the division of labor. The idea is that you're bringing workers together into factories to build things rather than just leaving them in their own workshops. So if you have one guy making tables in his own garage, he may make like one table a month. If you bring 10 of them together, they'll make more than 10 tables a month. Does that make sense? Because they'll work faster, they'll have all their tools near, and if you give each of them a specific job, they can go even faster. So efficiency increases, and you get more tables, or whatever you're making per month. The logical end of that was to not just give each worker an individualized job that they would do repetitively, but to actually bring the thing they're making to them. And that's what you're seeing here in this picture. The car's engine and its kind of centerpiece is put on tracks, just like railroad tracks, like these little rail lines. And the product is taken to one worker in his workstation after another, and it rolls on through. So you only have a certain amount of time to put in the bolt or whatever you're doing, put on the tire. You do that one little task over and over and over again for hours on end. And this thing would move along so quickly that Ford's company, Ford Motor Company, made more cars per hour, per day, per year than any other company because of this assembly line innovation. That they can flood the market with cars, which means what? What happens to the price of individual automobiles? Supply and demand hits in, the price goes down when you have an increase in supply, right? Ford believed that was a great thing for him because he was making them so fast and so cheaply that he can still turn a profit at selling cars at a reduced price. Does anyone want to take a guess at, this is the Model T, the kind of standard, no bells and whistles, just kind of stock car that he made. How much did you think they bought that thing for? $250. So pretty close. But obviously our money is hugely inflated. And back then you could take a nickel, you could take 5 cents and go buy a cheeseburger. Go buy an actual meal at a restaurant. So, it's not a direct comparison to today. But $250 even back then was enough for the working class to go buy a car. Average factory workers who had low wages could afford to buy an automobile. And that was his great insight. If you can drop the price to the point where not only the rich can buy these things, you can sell enough of them at a lower price, you can still turn an astronomical profit. And within 5 or 10 years, Ford's Motor Company took over the automobile industry. And they consolidate. They become a near monopoly. And he understood that he has a lot of his own factory workers, so he started selling cars to his own employees. So they literally ended up making their own vehicles that they drove. And he paid his workers higher than any other car-making plant. So he raised wages to get the best workers, the most efficient workers, gave them the most money to the point where they were kind of upper middle class and they were buying cars and larger houses than any of their kind of working class type people. And they're fairly happy to be doing this, right? They view this as a great deal for them. Until Ford starts going a little bit overboard. In his obsession with efficiency, he made it a fireable offense if you were talking while working. If you're talking to the workers around you, because that distracts you from your work. Or if you're whistling while you're working. That's taking away from efficiency. So eventually, we believe he has a kind of mental breakdown and starts coming up with some fairly loony ideas. But that was a well-known standard practice in his factory. If you talked, you got fired, and he had spies in his factories. Walking around, acting like average workers, spying on the others to see who's kind of getting out of line, that kind of stuff. Does that make sense? So Ford's company could be a very good one to work for the money and the guaranteed job and the access you had to kind of economic status, but could also be a very dreary job to actually perform on a daily basis. Literally taking like one screwdriver and turning one screw on one car after another over and over again for 8 or 10 hours a day. Monotonous to the point of, psychological destruction. Ford's name, his reputation, the Model T in itself become cultural icons. He becomes one of the richest men in the world in just a few years because of this innovation. So other companies start copying it. The assembly line tactic starts being used not just to make cars, but all kinds of different things in society. His name goes into pop culture. And one of the most famous books of the 1920s is called Brave New World. That was a science fiction book that imagined this kind of futuristic society where everything is made according to the assembly line tactic. And Ford becomes a deified kind of image. Instead of saying for God's sake, they say for Ford's sake. Stuff like that. Instead of having the Christian crosses, they cut off the top of them to make a T, an uppercase T, and they say that represents the Model T. So the idea of assembly line, the tactic itself, becomes a worship thing in the book. And this kind of terminology seeps into the popular culture. In the book, they mass produce humans. Humans are raised in test tubes. Genetic engineering. So that is imagined as early as the 1920s. And people are raised from an early age to be workers in certain jobs. Like if you're going to be an airplane mechanic, you have to be used to like walking around in an airplane, even upside down sometimes. So as a baby, they'll put you on rides and put you upside down and have you perform tasks to get your brain and your kind of physical abilities accustomed to like gravity-less types of environments. So a lot of this stuff starts becoming very popular, and the guy wrote the book because everything became so standardized in human society that human life became boring. That people are basically drugged up and kept young looking and happy until the day they die. So it's a big critique of what happens if you take these ideas too far. The automobile industry explodes in the early 1900s. Ford's kind of innovation is hitting right in the 19-teens. And this revolutionizes the American economy and the world economy as we look around today. The automobile industry, the creation of cars, don't just create a new industry for cars or a massively grown industry. Automobiles have been around for years by that point. But only the rich could afford them. Everyone else is still walking, or if you had some money, you might buy a horse or something like that. But the automobile industry creates a whole new level of the economy, a whole new sector of the whole national and today worldwide economy. The demand for steel and rubber, the basic building parts of automobiles, skyrockets because they're using them all over the place now. The price of oil skyrockets because gasoline is a derivative of oil. And gasoline becomes the major fuel of these automobiles, these combustion engines. Does anyone know what the original intended fuel was for these engines? For the diesel engine? What did Mr. Diesel want those engines to run on? vegetable oil, basically, because he wanted farmers to be able to supply their own fuel without having to buy it at market. But gasoline is much more rare, hard to refine out of oil, therefore expensive. So a lot of the major car makers also invest in oil companies to increase their profits also, which is something that is still ongoing. And we know today that cars don't run forever. You have to refuel them. So you get a whole gas station industry that rises up as refueling places every few miles for people that are running out of fuel. Service repair stations, parts places for parts of the machine that break down. These things that we see as common today are basically created within about 15 years, 15, 20 years. Highway construction that link different cities together. And people are now able to travel far enough to wake up in one place and travel many miles to go to work in another. So you get whole new communities that get built outside of the urban areas, outside of the big cities. They become known as the suburbs eventually. So the first suburbs start rising in the 20s, outside of the major cities, seen as kind of less dirty, less crime-ridden areas where you could live a safer life but still have your job in the city and make it there on a daily basis because you can travel further. The idea of going on vacation starts to rise in the 1920s because you can actually get into a car and go a few hundred miles away to a nicer place to stay, which was a different idea for people back then. And with the kind of nascent airline industry, planes are now starting to get reliable enough where they can fly up high enough to travel from city to city. And in the 1920s, you're going to start getting people flying from the east coast of the United States to Europe. So the whole idea of travel becomes a big important thing. Wealthy people like to travel. They always did, but it was usually just very rich people who could save the money to, number one, take the time off of working on a farm or a factory and actually go on vacation, then have the money to pay for the travel expenses. And does anyone know what percentage of the American economy today is estimated to be directly related to cars, automobiles? About 25%. One out of every $4 in the United States is somehow spent or used in the car industry, with gasoline, repair, parts, the cars themselves. So it's still a gigantic part of the U.S. economy. One of the major eventual problems, though, is that as other companies understand what Ford is doing and they start to take his innovation, they want to rebuild their factories to make them run with assembly lines to make them more efficient and therefore more profitable. It is expensive, though, to take all your machines out of your factory, put in these rails and redesign the whole thing, and then bring the workers back in and retrain them to get your assembly line tactic going. Therefore, only the richest companies can afford to make this investment. So only the richest corporations in the United States invest heavily in assembly lines, which makes their company more efficient, more profitable. So you're literally seeing the richest companies getting richer, and a lot of the companies that couldn't invest in this new efficiency are pushed out of the market. Because the richer companies that are more efficient can drop their prices and Walmart their enemies, lower their prices and destroy the competition. So this tends to be a consolidation of corporate wealth and power into fewer and fewer companies just through this assembly line type of competition. Does that make sense? Questions about that at all? That's a very important thing to understand in the 1920s. Corporations are re-emerging as the major centers of economic power in the country. They had been somewhat turned back a little bit in the Progressive era, up to about 1916 or so. But this is corporate power re-emerging. Oh, here's the cartoons. I knew I saw them today somewhere. A lot of corporations, just like they do today, tend to attack and try to remove unions from their workforce. And at this point in U.S. history, there is no guarantee that just because you start a union that the management is going to negotiate with you. They might just kick all your unionized workers out of your factory or wherever you're working and bring in new workers. It's not until the 1930s when the federal government says that the government will force management to negotiate with unions in collective bargaining, that unions get some kind of guaranteed survival. So unions are very much under attack, not just through corporate interests that want to reduce wages, therefore keep more profit for themselves, but also politically, because a lot of union leaders were identified as Bolsheviks, communists, socialists. So this is where you eventually get the picture of the Karl Marx looking kind of guy being pushed up by Bolshevik supporters, and they're going to burn the American flag and destroy the country with this idea of anarchy. How you identify anarchy with unionization is a mystery to me, because anarchy is the absence of order, right? The absence of government, whereas union often needs the support of government and is a more systematic list of demands. But they often make these connections between anarchy and socialism or communism and Karl Marx. And they often define a lot of communists as anti-American, unpatriotic, however you want to define that. They're definitely anti-capitalist, but that doesn't make them anti-American in every way, shape, and form. Let's see, some other political cartoons from the time, where you have for the call for unions in a factory starting to demand that they should go on strike to try to get better wages or better conditions or whatever, and they're raising the red flag, which is associated with the communist movement and the Lenin Bolshevik idea in general. Other ones, European anarchists sneaking up on the Statue of Liberty with not just a bomb but also a knife. So you get a lot of kind of emotional images that, as propaganda and advertising often do, they don't make much logical sense when you sit down and think about it, but it has an emotional pull, and it convinces a lot of people. Okay, Wilson was a Democratic Party president elected in 1912, re-elected in 16. So most of his, or in fact all of his second term in office, are obsessed with the Great War. What's the U.S. stance be? And eventually when the U.S. intervenes in the war and largely helps win the war for Britain and France, what should the peace treaty look like? So that takes years. Wilson pushed through his ideas into the peace treaty, couldn't get it ratified into the Senate, and was very much frustrated by that and very much worried about it, to the point where Wilson had a stroke before the election of 1920. So it's very obvious that he is pretty much incapacitated. He is not really running the White House on a day-to-day basis anymore. His lieutenants, his administrators are really running the place for the rest of his term. So he's not running for re-election in 1920. The Republican Party now reemerges under a pretty popular politician of the time named Warren Harding. He runs for president in 1920 under what he calls the return to normalcy. Basically, his argument is we have had about 20 years now of the progressive movement from 1901, 1902, going all the way up to the Great War, a kind of moralistic movement. We all have to work to help each other and make the country a better place. And then when the U.S. intervened in the war, they took that idea and spread it into Europe. This idea that the American government has the support of the masses, that they should guarantee equality and democracy in Europe. And he said, Warren Harding said in the election of 1920, we want to go back to a calmer government that isn't going to do these big grandiose things anymore. It's going to run the country for stability and prosperity. So that's his campaign slogan, basically. The return to what the U.S. government used to do, in being calm and quiet and just allowing things to occur economically, allowing businesses to grow, allowing the economy to take off. So his promise is to end a lot of what he thought was the kind of overexertion of government in the progressive era especially, and to really allow, he said if he gets into the White House, he's going to allow the economy to grow without much government intervention. And this is a very popular idea because you can only demand a big social movement from people for so long until they get tired. They just want things to be calm and quiet again, right? You can only get people to an emotional fever pitch for very long. It doesn't last forever. And in 1920, he seemed to really strike the mood of the country. Now that the war was over, they wanted things to just go back to being nice and calm and predictable again. They didn't want big uprisings anymore. So he sweeps into the office. He wins the presidency. The Republicans carry Congress, the Senate, and the House. So when Harding goes in, he has a lot of authority to put his plan into effect. And he brings business leaders into his government, into the administration. Guys that are directly opposed to a lot of the progressive era laws. So some of the government bodies that are put in charge of investigating, like meat packaging plants, he will put a guy who opposed that law in the first place in charge of the government bureaucracy that does the investigations. You get it? What will that leader do? As little as possible. Because they don't think that that government entity should have been created in the first place. This is like taking a person who doesn't believe the Navy should exist and making him Secretary of the Navy. That person's not going to do anything because they're diametrically opposed to that system existing. Does that make sense? Or not really doesn't make sense, but is that clear? So Harding takes these guys and appoints them to high office in positions that he knows they will either refuse to do their job, or they will be slow in doing their job, or they will critique the system that they're in charge of and maybe try to get it written out, get it eradicated. So Harding and the Republicans are seen at this point as an entirely pro-corporate, pro-business party. And he has a lot of quotes that say things like, the business of America is business. Commerce is the lifeblood of the nation, these kinds of things. So he's very obviously dedicated to his theory. He brings people into the Treasury Department that want to reduce taxes on the rich. And he brings them into the Commerce Department. He brings them into the high administrative levels. So his theory of taxation and the Republican Party theory as it emerges in the 20s is what we today call trickle-down economic theory. If you lower taxes on the rich and the business class, the corporations, they will not be paying as many taxes as they did before. Therefore, they will have more money on hand. If they have more money, they will invest it to grow their business. Which means they may build more factories, they may open more stores. If they build more factories, open more stores, they will employ more workers. So therefore, unemployment rate will go down. More people will be working, making a wage, so more people will be kind of invested in the system and being prosperous. And even if the rich don't build more factories or stores or hire more workers, they will take that extra money, they will either spend it in society by building big houses, which will employ contractors, construction workers. They will buy more cars, which will employ more car makers, more factory workers. They will either spend it in their business and investing, they will spend it on their own personal enjoyments, which will give more jobs to people that make those things. Or they will put it in bank accounts. And when banks get bigger accounts, they can have more cash to make loans, which means more average working people can get more loans to buy a house or buy a car or buy a refrigerator or whatever they want to buy. This is how the theory operates. Does that make sense? Is this idea still around today? Absolutely. This is the stuff that conservative economists today use. And it's still called this trickle-down theory. They didn't call it that in the 1920s, but it's the same idea. And when Harding went into office, he appointed people to run the tax policies that eradicated taxes on the rich. Taxes on the rich fall big time. And their incomes go up.
What was the tax rate before?
Oh, I'd have to look up the numbers. But they cut it by about 2/3. I mean, it's a big, big tax cut. And it mostly hits what we today think of as the millionaires of society. And this is the promise that is made. If you give them more money, they will hire more workers in some way, shape, or form, no matter what they do with that money. As president and having Congress really under his thumb, he can lead Congress in passing laws or retracting laws or really whatever they want to do. A lot of the progressive era laws that were passed to protect the usefulness of or the reliability and healthiness of the food supply or protect national forests or something, a lot of those laws are just flat out ignored by the people he puts into, say, the Treasury or stuff that we today would identify like the Environmental Protection Agency. A lot of those laws just are not enforced. So corporations, big companies often are, have the opportunity thrown open to them to run their businesses the way they had before these laws even went into effect, which are disastrous in a lot of ways, and there's a lot of scandals. And Harding's administration becomes known as having gigantic corporate scandals. A lot of the laws are also declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, especially when Harding starts making big appointments to the Supreme Court. He appoints members to the court that are avowedly and publicly against the progressive era. So they start literally knocking out those laws one after another. And Harding remains a very popular politician because the economy is growing very, very fast. This is one of the biggest economic growth rates in the 1920s in U.S. history. And it's really only surpassed by the 1950s, after World War II. So a lot of people looked around society, they saw a lot of prosperity, they saw a lot more factories being built, a lot more people being employed, and often making enough money to buy a new pair of shoes every year or buy cars or things like that. And there's a lot new, the electricity grid starts spreading out, so a lot of these cities become electrified. And a lot of small towns do, so you can plug in new inventions into your wall and you can get a lamp that actually works. Who knew? You start getting refrigerators in homes that are cheap enough to buy because they're being mass produced with the assembly line tactic. There is a general idea throughout the 20s that prosperity is growing, growing, growing. And that Harding, the Republican Party, and the United States economy has solved the major economic problems of the 1800s. The cyclical boom and bust economies. But today we all know what happens at the end of those 20s, right? The big bust hits. But we'll get to that a little bit later. So Harding is a very popular politician in his lifetime, even though there's a bunch of scandals and whatnot. The prosperity is so general that people just kind of overlook the scandals. Until a really big one hits that he seems to have been very worried about. I think it's a heart attack that knocks him out. He actually dies in office. So he dies in 1923, and his vice president rises. And his vice president is named Calvin Coolidge. He becomes the next president upon the death of Harding himself. And Coolidge will take the presidency in 23, run for re-election, and be overwhelmingly re-elected in 24 because his program is literally to do as little as possible to intervene in the economy. So he was also a very popular politician. Got re-elected in 24 and retired after the end of his second term, so you're going to get a different guy running for office in 28 and going into the presidency in 29. And you look at the 1920s economically, and you see some pretty stark differences. There are claims of general prosperity, but the working wages, the average per capita disposable income stays the same for 99% of the people in the country. the average workers and farmers. It stays completely flat throughout the whole decade. The major prosperity hits for the richest 1% of the whole country. And they see their incomes literally double by the end of the decade. And obviously in 1929 they're going to take a hit. But these are the real world implications of the trickle-down theory. Does it sound familiar? No? It should, because if you look at a chart of the past 30 years or so, it is the exact same thing. Because this trickle-down theory reemerges in the 1980s. And they cut corporate taxes and taxes on the rich in half in the 1980s. And we've seen this massive growth in prosperity for the top 1% again. And it's virtually the exact same chart. And we all know what happens at the end of the 2000s, right? 2007, 2008, you get the big bust. And economists point this out pretty consistently, but stuff like this doesn't make your presidential debates, does it? Or any kind of policy making decisions. I mean, they don't show charts like this for some reason. So questions about any of this so far? What the government is doing, what the economy is doing in general, why this stuff is happening? Nope. Perfect clarity. Okay. The Harding administration, this is where the Republican Party really starts turning more toward conservatism. A lot of Republican politicians are very much against women being allowed to vote. And the 19th Amendment does go through before the Republicans go into office in 21. And it's interesting because a lot of these politicians are actually elected with the help of women voting in 1920. There were a lot of fears in American society that, especially if you give women the right to vote, that all women will vote as a unified bloc for like one or two politicians. And since they make up virtually half the population, all I have to do is get some men to vote for those same politicians. And women will, there are some predictions that women will take over the presidency and Congress and everything because the women will most likely vote for other women. There's a lot of really wild predictions about what the result of women being allowed to vote would be. Doesn't actually happen because what do you know? Women disagree with each other politically. Who knew? Seems like a logical conclusion, but this is what happens with political fear very often. One of the big things that women demanded in electing in their first big election in 1920 is a so-called Shepherd-Towner Maternity Act, which gave federal funding to child care. So that law went through in 1921, and Republican leaders fought against it. And they eventually kill it by the end of the decade. I think it's rescinded. It's taken out like 1928 or so. So there is a very kind of jubilant women's movement that has succeeded in getting the vote and is actually starting to push through their decided policies by threatening to vote politicians out who don't vote in favor of this stuff. But over time, as the women's vote kind of splinters, as it naturally would, the Republicans are able to knock their demands out. Many women, because they are demanding government funding for certain things that are traditionally seen as personal responsibilities, a lot of women that supported this kind of stuff are accused of socialism or of being Bolsheviks themselves or being communists themselves. The fear of communism spreads throughout American society after the Russian Revolution, to the point where if you don't like something happening politically, you accuse it of socialism or communism or being a Bolshevik plot or something, and you can often kill it. You accuse it of being unpatriotic or anti-American, and a lot of people vote against it just because of that. Does that happen today? Without a doubt. Now we're seeing this on a daily basis. And to the point where women often support laws that would take children out of factories and put them in schools, which you would think would be a fairly logical thing to do for society. And they get accused of these child labor laws being Bolshevik plots. I mean, it gets pretty strange. But this is how people respond when their fears are built up. There's also a lot of scientific innovations, and particularly kind of factory innovations, that create a whole lot of new products that become very popular in the United States. And the spread of electricity was at the center of this. The harnessing of electricity to be the new main kind of industrial power source along with gasoline allows a lot of new technologies to spread up very, very quickly. And when they start using the assembly line strategy for making these new products, like electric toaster ovens, electric vacuums, instead of having to sweep and pick stuff out of the carpet in your house, you can use an electric vacuum. Probably one of the greatest inventions ever, right? For those of us who like to walk on clean floors. Electric refrigerators, so you can store food in your house for more than a few days, instead of having like a just very big chunk of ice to keep things cold. They called it an ice box back then. You get the invention, the creation of radio systems, transistor radios, so that people could have a radio in their house. And they took out loans to buy this stuff that they put on layaway or something like that. So average working people could often afford to buy this stuff. And radio is important because this gives people a connection to mass society, especially in the wake of the war. People would tune into the radio to listen to the latest news instead of having to wait the next day to read in a newspaper. And we're seeing that same kind of effect happen today, where you don't just turn on the radio, go to the internet, and you can read things that are happening on different parts of the world almost immediately, if they're being reported. So the spread of electrification of mass society creates whole new industries in itself. And you see the major jump in human population throughout the world, largely growing in the early 1900s when they start bringing electricity into hospitals. So you can get medical instruments that can measure the health of, say, a woman giving birth, or patients of different diseases. And you start seeing human population growth going astronomical in different parts of the world where they get electricity in hospitals. And electricity is seen as the clean energy supply. Before electricity, to power factories, people either burned coal or they burned wood to keep their houses warm, which created a lot of smoke out there in society, right? Electricity is clean, it's strong, and it's consistent. So it's seen as like this kind of wondrous new power source that isn't even dirty until you go to the coal plant that's generating the electricity for the most part in the United States and throughout the world at that point. Try to breathe that air. Or today, the nuclear plants. But the clean energy movement obviously continues, right, with people who want solar panels and windmills and stuff like that to generate the electricity that we use. And it literally revolutionizes society to the point where today, try to go one day without using something that plugs into a wall, right? I mean, we wouldn't even be sitting in here right now because we're relying on electric lights and car batteries in our cars to run our lights so we can see our way home and, blast our radio and whatnot. But electricity revolutionizes the human experience. People can stay up late at night. They can work at night under electric lights. They can do all kinds of different things. That just was not an option before. So there's a boom in radio ownership. Millions and millions and millions of these things are sold. And the big actors of the time went from the stage in theaters and they went to radio because this was the mass audience. And how did radio generate revenue to pay these big name actors? What does radio sell? Advertising space. So they'll put on a show for 45 minutes and sell the other 15 minutes as advertising space. And those advertisers pay a lot of money because they know a lot of people are listening to that show. Just like with television today. And what's the other giant revenue source today that you can access for free, but the owners of that company or those companies are making huge amounts of money, billions of dollars a year? Facebook. You join for free. You never pay for anything, right? But they're selling your identity. They're selling your history of viewing to advertisers. And same thing with Google. Does anyone know what the profit, the yearly revenue for Google is? $38 billion a year off of keeping track of what you search for and selling advertising space in your email and whatnot and YouTube. This is big, big business. And it started really with radio, or started before that with newspapers selling advertising space. But the idea of buying a radio, but you don't have to buy the airwaves, you don't have to pay the company to listen to their programming. You get it for free. The reason you get it for free is because they're selling you to someone else. And because a lot of people had wage jobs, they had consistent paychecks. If they don't get injured and get fired. A lot of Americans start buying things on credit in the 1920s because you have the combination of a whole lot of new inventions that become very popular. And the families, the people who didn't buy the new car, the new refrigerator, they become so uncool that they're like living in the Stone Age. So it becomes a social contest to buy the newest invention, even when you don't have the money to actually pay for it now. So you take off loans, you buy things on credit, you buy things on layaway, anything you can do to get the newest kind of modern lifestyle. And you see the growth of debt. These are the 1900s. So you see it's in the 19-teens it was fairly high, and it just grows astronomically in the 20s and grows to a whole new level. And then with the crash, people have to buy things on credit just to survive, so it grows even further. And of course the economy, GDP, is shrinking, so you have credit growing and the overall economy shrinking. You get that rise to 270. Let's see. And yeah, we've already talked about most of these, but again, the whole idea of buying, especially the newest car, the car becomes almost a symbol of the modern life, just like the railroad had in the 1800s. So we've already seen this chart and a lot of these kinds of statements. The car affected a whole lot of people's just daily lives. They drove to work in them. They lived further away in suburbs. They traveled. It even affected dating patterns. Before the car, if you wanted to date someone, if you're a male and you want to ask a girl out, on your first few dates, and oftentimes many dates after that, you would take her brother or her mother out on the date with you as a chaperone. Because you couldn't get away from them. But when you start rolling up in a car and pick her up fast and leave as fast as possible, the whole kind of dating ritual shifts. And obviously the parents were very afraid of this stuff, right? And the 1920s represents the gigantic shift in the American economy and the American psyche in general in relation to what they're buying and how much they're saving. Prior to the 1920s, the American people, by and large, were obsessed with working hard, saving money, making long-term investments, strategy, long-term strategizing for their financial future. That largely shifts in the 20s. This is where you see the gigantic turnaround. where the American people become much more interested in spending power. How much money do I have in my pocket right now? What can I buy with it immediately? Immediate gratification and very little long-term planning, to the point where they go into debt to buy more and more things. As one of my favorite comedians used to say, buying crap they don't need with money they don't have. But what is the power that keeps you believing that you need these things? What convinces you? I mean, refrigerators are useful things, but once you have a refrigerator, do you have to buy another one 2 years later? Once you have a pair of shoes, do you have to go buy another one? So what convinces people to do this? Or buy a new car every few years? Why do you guys do this? I don't. I try to save my money. But why do you guys go off and buy the same thing again and again and again and again? What convinces you to do that? Advertising. They tell you emotionally, symbolically, that if you don't keep on buying the newest thing, you're going to fall behind. For instance, here's my phone. It's an old phone. I got it for free because I'm cheap. And the new iPhone came out, last weekend? How much is that thing? How much? 200, 500? It depends. Huh. Why do you need to do this? There are phones everywhere. There's a phone right there. It's a mystery to me, but people are somehow convinced. And once people buy their phone, what's the first thing they do? Do they call people? No, they take it to their friend's house and say, look at my new phone. And there's even a commercial. Have you seen the commercial? I think it was from last Christmas, where it literally said, what's the point in buying a new phone unless you're going to show it off while you're standing in line to buy stuff? I don't know, maybe to call people? Isn't that the function of phones? But this is a critical view of this stuff. Yeah. Wait. I have a couple videos to show you about the power of advertising, because the modern advertising industry as we know it today rose in the 1920s. And it rose according to the major psychological theories of its time. The theories of Sigmund Freud. But this will be, I think it's a few minutes long, but it gives us a quick kind of directed history about a certain guy who largely builds the modern advertising industry named Edward Bernays, and how he brings Sigmund Freud's theories from Europe and uses them in corporate America. And it's generally true about the American population today, I would say. People who would prefer to sit around and consume things rather than contribute anything, and are overwhelmed with desire irrationally. People want things constantly without knowing why they want them. These are largely victims of concentrated advertising industry. I have another one because the major question after advertising and creating a desires-based society is what happens to democracy? What happens to how politicians advertise themselves to you when they try to get your vote? Do they hit you with information anymore? No, they hit you with emotion, anger, fear, optimism, hope. They run off of that. So this guy Bernays also started thinking about how to rebuild democracy to fit the needs of his new society. And there's that guy. Favorite guy out of both videos. Just thoughtlessly enjoying what's in front of him without really considering larger political or social problems. And you're seeing the same kind of stuff today. A lot of people are not concerned with the elections that are about to happen, but they are very concerned with the fact that, you know, a football game may have a bad result because of some poor officials. I mean, an outside sport that has no importance in virtually anybody's life is now become the centerpiece of a lot of people's daily existence. People are often now spending more time in their distractions than they are thinking about things that have a real world impact on them. Okay, so we'll stop there at the 20s. Next time we'll talk about U.S. foreign policy in the 20s.